The Pacific Ocean was merciless at dawn, but Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell had learned long ago that mercy was a luxury soldiers couldn't afford. She stood at the edge of Naval Base Coronado, her athletic frame silhouetted against the pale orange sky, watching the waves crash against the shore with hypnotic intensity. Salt spray stung her sunburned face, leaving crystalline deposits on her combat fatigues. Her blonde hair, pulled back in a tight military bun, revealed sharp features that had become increasingly familiar to news outlets across the country. But Sarah never read the articles. She didn't care about being called historic or groundbreaking. She only cared about one thing: proving that she belonged. 28 years old, Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell had just accomplished what military officials said was impossible. 3 months ago, she had graduated from Bud-S, Basic Underwater Demolition SEAL Training, becoming the first woman in the program's entire history to earn the coveted Trident insignia. The achievement had not come easily. It had cost her everything. She thought back to her childhood in suburban Colorado, where she'd first discovered her capacity for endurance. Her father, a retired Air Force pilot, had raised her to believe that limitations were illusions created by weak minds. He'd pushed her to run farther, climb higher, push harder than any boy in her school. At 12, she was completing half marathons. At 16, she was competing in CrossFit competitions against adults. At 22, she'd enlisted in the Navy with a singular obsession: to become a SEAL. Nobody took her seriously at first. The Navy had only officially opened SEAL training to women in 2016, and since then, hundreds had tried. Exactly zero had succeeded. Sarah was told repeatedly, in countless ways, that her body wasn't built for the demands, that women lacked the testosterone-driven aggression required for close-quarters combat, that she would inevitably fail, and when she did, the entire military establishment would laugh. The women's movement had made a mistake, they said, trying to prove equality in a field where equality was biologically impossible. Sarah had let those voices fuel her. The Bud-S experience had been apocalyptic. 8 weeks of Hell Week alone, a grueling 132-hour marathon of continuous training with minimal sleep, had broken men who were larger, stronger, and more experienced than her. Sarah had completed it barely conscious, her body pushed beyond what she'd thought possible. Hypothermia, muscle failure, hallucinations. She'd endured it all. When she'd crossed that finish line, tears streaming down her face, she'd realized that the physical challenge was only half the battle. The other half was psychological warfare. Throughout the entire program, she'd been watched differently. Officers scrutinized her performance with a level of skepticism they never applied to male trainees. When she succeeded, it was luck. When she failed, it was proof that women didn't belong. The male trainees had developed an unspoken rule: don't train with the woman, don't befriend the woman, don't acknowledge the woman. Loneliness became her constant companion, a weight as heavy as the 80-pound pack she carried during forced marches. But Sarah had persevered. She'd learned to run on salt and spite, to transform rejection into rocket fuel. And when she'd finally received her Trident pin, that small golden insignia representing the ultimate achievement in naval special operations, she'd felt something transcendent. Not triumph, something deeper: vindication, proof that she was unstoppable. That was 3 weeks ago. Now, standing on this beach at dawn, Sarah felt the weight of her achievement settling into her bones like lead. The celebration had been brief, almost perfunctory. There were photographs with senior commanders who looked uncomfortable, press releases emphasizing inclusion and diversity, and whispers from certain quarters of the military community. Those whispers cut deeper than any insult. They suggested that her achievement had been a statistical anomaly, an exception that would soon be forgotten. Today was supposed to change that. Today marked her assignment to an elite close-quarters combat unit based out of San Diego. It was a fast-track position, the kind of assignment that could lead to command positions and special operations leadership. The kind of assignment that would prove, once and for all, that her success wasn't a fluke. Sarah walked through the base gates, her sea bag slung over her shoulder, her boots striking the pavement with precise rhythm. The facility ahead was utilitarian and imposing: concrete structures, faded paint, windows that reflected nothing but sky. This was where the best soldiers in the world came to become even better, and somewhere inside that building was Commander James Garrett. She'd done her homework on him. Everyone had. James Garrett was a living legend within naval special operations circles. He'd served in Vietnam, Panama, and the Middle East. He had more combat missions under his belt than most soldiers had days of service. He'd been decorated repeatedly, commended for his tactical brilliance and his unwavering commitment to excellence. There were stories about Garrett, how he could break men psychologically during training, how he demanded perfection, how operatives who trained under him had an unprecedented survival rate in the field. But there were other stories too, whispers from soldiers who trained under his command, rumors about his methods being outdated, his approach to discipline being unnecessarily harsh. One article Sarah had read mentioned that Garrett had been passed over for promotion twice, which had apparently made him bitter. But she dismissed those concerns. Every great military leader was a little ruthless. Every exceptional commander demanded things that seemed unreasonable to ordinary people. Sarah pushed through the facility doors, her eyes adjusting to the fluorescent lighting. The interior smelled of metal polish and sweat. Through a corridor, she could see soldiers training, executing combat drills with mechanical precision, moving through obstacle courses that defied logic, pushing themselves beyond human limits. This was her world now. This was where she belonged. A secretary directed her to Garrett's office on the 3rd floor. As Sarah climbed the stairs, her heart began to accelerate, not from fear but from anticipation. This was the moment where her new chapter began. Everything she'd worked for, every sacrifice she'd made, every obstacle she'd overcome, it had all led to this. The office door was open. Commander James Garrett sat behind a massive mahogany desk, reviewing documents. He was larger than Sarah expected, perhaps 6'2", with the muscular physique of someone who'd maintained peak physical condition throughout his decades of service. His face was weathered, marked by lines that spoke of decades in the sun and stress of command. His eyes were ice blue, and they looked up from his papers with an intensity that made Sarah's breath catch. "Lieutenant Mitchell," he said, his voice deep and gravelly. He didn't stand to greet her. "I've been expecting you." He gestured to a chair across from his desk. Sarah sat, her posture perfect, her hands folded in her lap. She was acutely aware of how she appeared to him, a woman in a man's uniform, an outsider trying to prove her worth. Garrett leaned back in his chair, studying her with an expression that was difficult to read. "Congratulations on completing Bud S," he said, but there was something in his tone that didn't sound congratulatory. "You're aware that this unit has never had a female operator?" "Yes, sir," Sarah responded. "And you believe you're ready for this assignment?" "I know I am, sir." Garrett's lips curved into something that might have been a smile, but his eyes remained cold. "We'll see about that, Lieutenant. We'll see about that." In that moment, Sarah felt a flutter of unease in her chest. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Something in the way Garrett looked at her, not with the professional assessment she'd experienced from other commanders, but with something darker, something personal. She had no way of knowing that her life was about to change forever, or that the man sitting before her was about to become the catalyst for a reckoning that would shake the Navy to its foundations. "Welcome to the unit," Garrett said, turning back to his documents. "Training begins tomorrow at 600 hours. Don't be late." Sarah nodded, stood, and left the office, her mind already calculating what she needed to prepare. But deep in her instincts, that same instinct that had kept her alive through Hell Week, something whispered a warning. The real test was about to begin. The sun hadn't yet crested the horizon when Sarah arrived at the training facility. 5:45 hours. 15 minutes early, just as she'd calculated. She'd learned through her entire military career that punctuality was a form of respect, a way of demonstrating commitment before words were even spoken. The facility was already alive with activity, operators moving through warm-up drills, the sound of heavy bags being struck with relentless precision, the rhythmic pounding of feet on the treadmills. Commander Garrett stood in the center of the main training floor, arms crossed, watching the operators with the intensity of a hawk surveying prey. When he saw Sarah enter, his eyes tracked her movement with an attention that felt different from the casual awareness he showed the other soldiers. She felt the weight of his gaze as she approached and stood at attention. "You're early," he said, his voice carrying across the empty space between them. "Yes, sir. I believe in arriving prepared, sir." Something flickered across his face, a tightening around the eyes, a subtle shift in his expression. "Preparation is good, but punctuality without excellence is just theater, Mitchell. Can you give me excellence?" "Yes, sir. We'll see." That first week was an education in selective cruelty. Garrett designed the training exercises to push every operator to their physical and mental limits, but he seemed to reserve his harshest criticisms for Sarah. When other soldiers completed a combat drill with minor flaws, he nodded and moved on. When Sarah executed the same drill flawlessly, he found problems that didn't exist. "Your grip was weak on that last takedown," he barked during a Wednesday afternoon session, despite the fact that Sarah had executed the move with textbook precision. The other operators exchanged glances but said nothing. "Your footwork is sloppy. A real opponent would have exploited that gap," he said Thursday, watching her complete an obstacle course in record time, faster than several male operators who'd trained ahead of her. By Friday, Sarah had filled 3 pages in her leather journal with documented incidents. She wrote in precise military language, noting dates, times, witnesses, and exact quotes. The habit had started during Bud S., when she'd realized that documentation was the only protection against subjective accusations. She'd learned that in military culture, memory was malleable, but written records were irrefutable. The other operators had begun to notice Garrett's focus on Sarah. Sergeant Marcus Webb, a veteran who'd served with distinction in 3 deployments, approached her during a break on the second week. His weathered face showed concern, and his voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Watch yourself with Garrett," he said, glancing over his shoulder to ensure the commander wasn't within earshot. "He's different with you." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, though she already knew. "I've trained under a lot of hard-ass commanders, and I'm not complaining about physical demands. That's the job. But there's something else going on here, something personal. Just be careful." Sarah appreciated the warning, but she also understood the implications. If Garrett sensed that she discussed his behavior with other operators, it could escalate the situation. So she simply nodded and thanked Webb, then returned to the training floor, where Garrett was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. The scrutiny intensified in the 3rd week. Garrett began singling her out for additional training sessions, keeping her long after the other operators had been dismissed. These sessions were ostensibly designed to help her improve her technique, but something about them felt wrong. His instructions became personal rather than professional. He'd stand unnecessarily close during demonstrations. His corrections focused increasingly on her body, the way she moved, the way she breathed, the way her muscles engaged during various maneuvers. "You're too tense," he said during one evening session, placing his hands on her shoulders to adjust her posture. The contact lasted longer than necessary. "Relax, trust your body." Sarah forced herself to remain still, to not react to the discomfort crawling up her spine. She'd been trained to endure physical contact during combat drills, but this felt different. This felt intentional in a way that had nothing to do with training. The team dynamic began to shift. The other operators, who'd been cautiously warming up to Sarah, suddenly became distant. She'd catch them watching her with expressions of sympathy mixed with fear. During lunch breaks, they'd sit together in groups that seemed designed to exclude her. She understood what was happening. Garrett's favoritism had transformed her from a potential team member into a source of tension. On a Friday afternoon, after Garrett had spent 30 minutes correcting Sarah's stance while maintaining unnecessary physical contact, Petty Officer James Chen pulled her aside. His voice was urgent, his expression grave. "He's isolating you," Chen said. "That's how he works. He picks someone, makes them the focus of his attention, and then everyone else distances themselves because they don't want to be associated with whatever he's doing." "What is he doing?" Sarah asked. "I don't know exactly, but I know it's not good. In my last deployment, there was a female intelligence officer attached to our unit. Garrett fixated on her the same way he's fixating on you. She requested reassignment within a month. Wouldn't talk about why, but she was scared." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. She'd encountered difficult commanders before, but this was something else. This was deliberate, calculated, designed to destabilize her psychologically, and the worst part was that it was working. She found herself second-guessing her every move, wondering if she was performing well enough, if her presence on the team was truly creating friction, if maybe they were right about women in combat roles. That night, alone in her barracks, Sarah allowed herself to feel the full weight of her isolation. She sat on her bunk, her leather journal open on her lap, adding new entries with trembling hands. She documented how the team had begun excluding her, how Garrett's behavior had become increasingly inappropriate, how the entire atmosphere of the unit had shifted since her arrival. But she also wrote something else, a private note to herself. "I will not be broken by this. I did not survive Hell Week to be destroyed by one man's insecurity." The second week of Garrett's intensified attention came with a new development. He began commenting on her appearance in ways that crossed professional boundaries. "That uniform looks good on you, Mitchell," he said one morning, his eyes lingering in a way that made her skin crawl. Another day, he mentioned that she was prettier than she had any right to be for a soldier, which didn't even make logical sense, but was clearly designed to make her feel like her femininity was the only thing he saw. Sarah began planning her responses, strategizing how to protect herself. She started wearing a body camera to training sessions, hidden beneath her combat uniform, a precaution that felt paranoid but necessary. She altered her schedule to avoid being alone with Garrett whenever possible. She increased her physical training regimen, channeling her anxiety and fear into push-ups, runs, and combat drills that left her exhausted but focused. The other operators watched this transformation with a mixture of respect and concern. Sarah was becoming harder, colder, more isolated. She was becoming a loner by necessity, not choice. And in the process, she was losing something, not her strength, but her sense of belonging. By the end of the third week, Sarah had documented 47 separate incidents of inappropriate behavior by Commander James Garrett. She'd written down every comment, every physical contact, every moment when his attention crossed from professional into something darker and more dangerous. She didn't know what she would do with this documentation. She didn't know if anyone in the chain of command would believe her. She didn't know if reporting Garrett would end her career, mark her as a troublemaker, damage the reputation she'd spent years building. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Something was building, something dark and dangerous, and she needed to be ready for whatever came next. Because deep in her warrior's instinct, in the part of her that had pushed through Hell Week, that had defied every limitation placed on her, Sarah understood that this situation would eventually reach a breaking point. And when it did, she needed to be prepared to survive it. The extraction mission was designed to test every aspect of an operator's tactical capability. 24 soldiers were divided into 4 teams, each tasked with infiltrating a mock enemy position, neutralizing targets, and extracting a hostage in under 40 minutes. The course was complex, multiple obstacles, simulated gunfire, time pressure designed to fracture focus and decision-making. Sarah's team was assigned the most difficult position. The mock compound was positioned in a valley, protected by multiple elevated sniper positions, with only one logical extraction route. It was a nightmare scenario designed to separate the exceptional operators from the ordinary ones. But Sarah was exceptional. From the moment the exercise began, she moved with perfect synchronization with her team. Her spatial awareness was extraordinary. She seemed to anticipate her teammates' movements before they made them. When the sniper fire started, she calculated angles of fire and identified cover positions that others had missed. When they reached the compound, she executed a breach maneuver that was textbook perfect, her body moving with the kind of fluid precision that came from thousands of hours of repetition. The extraction took 31 minutes. 3 of the other teams hadn't finished in 40. As Sarah and her team emerged from the exercise area, sweat-drenched and breathing hard, she could see Garrett standing on the observation platform, his face unreadable. The other operators on her team were already celebrating their success, high-fiving and congratulating each other. But Sarah watched Garrett carefully, reading the tension in his jaw, the way his hands had clenched into fists. He knew she'd beaten him. That evening, as Sarah was finishing her workout in the facility's empty gym, her phone buzzed with a message: "Report to my office. Now." Her pulse accelerated, but she kept her movements measured and controlled. She showered quickly, changed into fresh fatigues, and made her way to the 3rd floor. The administrative offices were empty at this hour. Most personnel had already left for the day. The only sound was the echo of her footsteps on the concrete floor. Garrett's office door was closed. Sarah knocked and waited for his command to enter. "Come in." She pushed the door open and stepped inside. Garrett sat behind his desk, but unlike their previous meetings, he wasn't reviewing documents. He was simply sitting there, watching her with an intensity that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. "Close the door," he said. Sarah did, her hand lingering on the doorknob for a moment, a subconscious part of her nodding the closed door, the isolation, the lack of witnesses. Her combat training, honed through years of preparing for threats, was beginning to sound alarms in her nervous system. "That was quite a performance today," Garrett said, his voice low and controlled. "Perhaps too good a performance. It's making people wonder if I'm doing something wrong." "Sir, I was simply executing the mission parameters." "Executing?" Garrett stood abruptly, his massive frame rising from behind the desk. "You were showing off. You were making the other operators look bad. You were making me look bad. And why? So you could prove something. So you could prove that you belong here, that women deserve to be in the Navy." Sarah remained silent, her eyes fixed on a point above his shoulder, a technique she'd learned from managing confrontational situations. Don't engage emotionally. Don't react. Stay calm. "I have been a commander in the United States Navy for 27 years, Garrett continued, his voice rising. He moved around the desk, and Sarah could feel him getting closer. "I have trained the finest soldiers in the world. I have earned my position through blood and sweat and sacrifice, and I will not have it undermined by someone playing dress-up in a uniform that doesn't belong to them. Commander, if there's a concern about my performance—" "Your performance," Garrett's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Your performance is the problem, Lieutenant. Your very presence here is a problem. You're a distraction. You're a political statement. You're not a real soldier." Sarah's jaw tightened, but she maintained her composure. She'd heard these words before, in different forms from different people. They were designed to wound, to make her question herself, to crack the psychological armor she'd built. "This unit needs to be reminded what real soldiering looks like," Garrett said, and he was now standing directly in front of her, close enough that she could smell the coffee and anger on his breath. "This unit needs to understand that some people are simply not equipped for this level of commitment, and I think it's time someone taught you that lesson." What happened next occurred in the space between heartbeats. Garrett's hand shot out, reaching for Sarah's collar. His movement was fast, but it was the movement of a man who had never trained against someone with her level of conditioning and reaction time. It was the movement of a man accustomed to people backing down, to people being afraid, to people yielding before violence was even fully committed. Sarah's body responded before her conscious mind caught up. Years of combat training, muscle memory forged through thousands of repetitions, burst into action. She pivoted left, her movement creating distance while simultaneously bringing her hands into a defensive position. Garrett's grab found only air and fabric. But he was committed now, his rage overriding any tactical awareness. He lunged forward, attempting to close the distance, to use his weight advantage to overpower her. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Sarah sidestepped his lunge, grabbed his outstretched arm, and executed a perfect leverage takedown. The same maneuver she'd practiced 10,000 times, the same move that had helped her graduate from Bud S. using Garrett's own momentum against him. She pivoted her hips and threw him forward and down. Garrett's massive body crashed into the floor with a sound like thunder. The impact was so violent that the furniture rattled. His breath came out in a desperate gasp as the wind was knocked from his lungs. He lay on his stomach, stunned and gasping, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Sarah stood above him, her breathing controlled, her hands still in a defensive position. She was entirely prepared to move again if he attempted to rise, but Garrett remained on the ground, his body heaving as he struggled to recover from the impact. "Sir," Sarah said, her voice steady and calm, "I am a real soldier. I have earned my place in this unit, and I will not be disrespected." Garrett rolled onto his back, his face a mixture of rage and humiliation. His eyes burned with a fury that transcended normal anger. He looked at Sarah like she had become his mortal enemy in that single moment. "You have no idea what you've just done," he said, his voice hoarse and dangerous. "You have just assaulted a superior officer. That's a federal crime, Mitchell. Your career is finished. I will ensure that you are prosecuted to the fullest extent of military law." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She understood immediately what had happened. She had defended herself against physical assault, but in the eyes of the military chain of command, she had just attacked a superior officer. She had just given Garrett exactly what he needed to destroy her. Garrett pulled himself to his feet, dusting off his uniform with deliberate movements. His eyes never left hers, and in those ice-blue depths, Sarah saw something that terrified her more than any physical threat. She saw calculation. She saw a man who had just been given the perfect justification for his actions. "Get out of my office," he said coldly. "Report to the commanding officer first thing tomorrow morning. I'm sure he'll be very interested to hear about how you assaulted me." Sarah left the office, her mind reeling. She had done everything right. She had defended herself against unprovoked physical assault. She had used the exact amount of force necessary to neutralize the threat. She had followed every protocol she'd been taught. But as she walked down the empty hallway, she understood the terrible truth. None of that mattered. She had just made the most powerful enemy of her military career. And she had absolutely no proof that he'd attacked her first. The notification came at 4:30 hours the next morning. Sarah hadn't slept. She'd spent the entire night sitting on her bunk, her journal open, documenting every detail of what had occurred in Garrett's office. Her hands had trembled as she wrote, cataloging the exact sequence of events, the words he'd used, the way he'd approached her. She'd also done something else. She'd reviewed her phone's hidden recordings, the audio files she'd secretly captured during previous encounters with Garrett. Those files were insurance, evidence that could corroborate her version of events. But as she read the official summons to appear before Captain Michael Richardson, the commanding officer of the entire facility, Sarah felt a creeping dread that no amount of documentation could dispel. She arrived at Richardson's office at 700 hours, her uniform immaculate, her posture perfect, her face a mask of military professionalism. Richardson was a man in his early 60s, with gray hair and the bearing of someone who'd spent 4 decades navigating military bureaucracy. He gestured for her to sit. "Lieutenant Mitchell," he began, consulting a report on his desk, a report that Sarah would later learn had been written entirely by Garrett. "I've received some serious allegations regarding your conduct yesterday evening. Commander Garrett reports that you physically assaulted him in his office. That's a very grave charge." Sarah's mouth went dry. This was exactly what she'd feared. Garrett had beaten her to the punch, had controlled the narrative before she could present her version of events. "Sir, with respect, that's not what happened," Sarah said carefully. "Commander Garrett physically attacked me. I defended myself using appropriate self-defense techniques. I have documentation of months of inappropriate conduct by the commander, and I can provide recordings of previous incidents." Richardson held up his hand, silencing her. "Commander Garrett is a decorated officer with an impeccable record. He has no history of disciplinary issues. You, on the other hand, are a recent addition to this unit who has been involved in multiple incidents that have created tension within the team." "Those incidents were initiated by Commander Garrett," Sarah protested. "According to whom?" Richardson's voice remained calm, but there was an edge to it now. "According to you, according to your interpretation of events. You understand that your word against a commander's word carries very different weight in military proceedings." Sarah felt the foundation beneath her crumbling. She'd expected skepticism, but this was something worse. This was institutional dismissal. Richardson wasn't interested in hearing her side. He'd already decided. "I also have witnesses," Sarah said. "Petty Officer Chen, Sergeant Webb, they can testify to Commander Garrett's behavior toward me." "Those individuals will be questioned, of course," Richardson said. "But I should warn you that filing false accusations against a superior officer is itself a serious offense. I would strongly encourage you to reconsider your story before you damage your career further." The threat was unmistakable. Sarah understood what was being communicated. If she pursued this, if she continued to insist that Garrett had attacked her, she would be the one facing prosecution. The power of command had just been leveraged against her with surgical precision. Over the next 72 hours, the narrative calcified. Garrett gave an official statement to the investigating officer, a captain named Derek Morrison, in which he claimed that Sarah had become increasingly unstable and resentful about her position in the unit. He said that during a routine meeting to discuss her performance, she had suddenly attacked him without provocation. He claimed he'd been trying to defend himself when she'd executed the takedown, that he'd sustained minor injuries, none of which were visible, and that he was considering pressing charges. Garrett had also been busy behind the scenes, leveraging his decades of connections and his extensive network within the Navy. Officers who Sarah didn't even know began approaching her with expressions that ranged from sympathy to barely concealed contempt. The message was consistent. They'd heard what had happened, and they believed Garrett's version. Petty Officer Chen was called into Richardson's office and emerged looking shaken. He wouldn't make eye contact with Sarah afterward. Sergeant Webb was transferred to a different unit within 24 hours, so abruptly that Sarah barely had time to say goodbye. The message was clear: support Sarah and face consequences. The rest of the unit began to distance themselves. Operators who'd been cordial started eating lunch away from her. During training exercises, she found herself placed in teams with the least experienced soldiers, effectively sidelined from the more complex operations. The message being communicated was humiliating and deliberate. "You are not one of us." Sarah requested a formal investigation, but Captain Morrison's preliminary report was devastating. In carefully worded military language, he'd concluded that Sarah's account of events appears inconsistent with available evidence, and that the testimony of Commander Garrett, a senior officer with an exemplary service record, is more credible than the claims of a junior officer with apparent emotional instability. Emotional instability. Those two words became her scarlet letter. The psychological toll mounted daily. Sarah would wake in the morning with her heart pounding, her mind racing through scenarios. Would this be the day they discharged her? Would this be the day they arrested her? She stopped eating much. Her weight dropped noticeably, and she knew people were interpreting her physical decline as further evidence of emotional problems. She tried to reach out to the Navy's equal opportunity officer, a captain named Susan Winters, hoping that there might be some institutional mechanism for addressing gender-based harassment. Winters listened to her story with apparent concern, took notes, and promised to investigate. 2 weeks later, Sarah received a brief email stating that no actionable evidence of gender-based harassment was found, and that the matter was being closed. Sarah sat in her barracks at night, her leather journal filled with hundreds of pages of documentation, her phone containing audio recordings that proved Garrett's inappropriate behavior, and she confronted the terrifying reality. None of it mattered. The system she'd fought to be part of, the institution she'd risked everything to join, was closing ranks to protect one of its own. She considered going to the press. She had friends who'd offered to help her contact journalists to tell her story publicly, but she knew the consequences of that choice. Going public would be seen as a betrayal, would confirm every narrative that she was unstable and vindictive. Her career would be finished not just in the Navy, but throughout the defense industry. The isolation became suffocating. She had no allies, no witnesses willing to speak on her behalf, no institutional mechanism for justice. She had only her documentation and her knowledge that she was telling the truth. But in a system designed to protect hierarchy and authority, the truth mattered less than power. 3 weeks after the incident in Garrett's office, Sarah received official notification that she was being placed on administrative leave pending the conclusion of the investigation. The investigation, she learned, had been indefinitely postponed. She was effectively in limbo, not discharged, but not permitted to perform her duties. Garrett continued to report to work, continued to command the unit, continued his life as if nothing had happened. Sarah watched from a distance as he trained other operators, as he conducted exercises, as he laughed with officers who'd once respected her. One evening, as Sarah sat in her barracks in the darkness, staring at her phone's recording app, she considered simply deleting everything. Deleting the journals, destroying the recordings, walking away from the Navy quietly. It would be easier. It would end the torture of the endless limbo. But then she thought about the female intelligence officer that Chen had mentioned, the one Garrett had fixated on before Sarah arrived. She thought about how many other women might have experienced what she was experiencing, might have been silenced by the same institutional mechanisms that were silencing her. And Sarah made a decision. She wouldn't go quietly. She wouldn't accept this injustice. She would find another way, a way that didn't rely on the broken system that was supposed to protect her. Because sometimes, she realized, the greatest act of resistance is simply refusing to disappear. Master Chief Petty Officer Marcus Chen had been watching Sarah for weeks, observing her isolation, her weight loss, the way her eyes had become haunted and distant. He'd served in the Navy for 32 years, long enough to recognize institutional injustice when he saw it, long enough to understand what happened when powerful men decided to destroy inconvenient people. He appeared at her barracks door on a Tuesday evening, just after sunset. His weathered face was grim, and he checked over his shoulder before speaking, making sure they weren't being observed. "We need to talk," he said quietly, "but not here, not anywhere on base." They met at a coffee shop in downtown San Diego, deliberately public but crowded enough to avoid being noticed. Chen ordered black coffee and gestured for Sarah to sit across from him in a corner booth. "I know what happened with Garrett," Chen began, his voice low. "And I know you've been isolated because of it. I also know that you're considering doing something desperate, maybe going to the press, maybe leaving the military entirely. I'm here to tell you that there's a third option." Sarah's heart accelerated. "What do you mean?" "I mean you're not the first," Chen said, his eyes heavy with the weight of old knowledge. "Garrett has been doing this for years. There's a pattern, and if you're willing to look deeper, you'll find other people who have experienced what you have." "The intelligence officer," Sarah said, "the woman from your last deployment." Chen nodded. "Her name is Lieutenant Patricia Gomez. She's currently stationed at Naval Base San Diego, about 15 minutes from here. She also experienced something with Garrett, though she was never brave enough to fight back. When I heard what happened to you, I knew I had to reach out, because Gomez has been carrying guilt for years about not reporting him." "Would she testify?" Sarah asked, hope and fear warring in her chest. "I don't know," Chen admitted. "But there's someone else you need to meet. Her name is Lieutenant Commander Rebecca Torres. She's a JAG officer, Judge Advocate General. She handles cases involving abuse of authority and misconduct. She's one of the few people in this institution who actually cares about justice rather than protecting hierarchy." 2 days later, Sarah found herself sitting across from Rebecca Torres in a secure meeting room at the JAG office. Torres was a woman in her early 40s, with dark hair pulled back severely and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She had the bearing of someone who'd spent years fighting institutional corruption from within. "Marcus Chen came to me with your situation," Torres began, and she didn't mince words. "He believes you have documentation of months of inappropriate conduct by Commander Garrett. Is that accurate?" "Yes," Sarah said. She brought her journal and her phone, ready to present her evidence. Torres reviewed the documentation with meticulous care, her expression darkening with each page she read. When she finished, she set the materials down carefully and looked directly at Sarah. "This is comprehensive," Torres said. "Detailed, specific, with dates and witnesses. It's exactly what we need. But I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Are you prepared for what comes next? Because once we start this process, there's no stopping it. Garrett will fight back. The command structure will close ranks. Your career in the Navy will likely be over regardless of the outcome." Sarah considered the question carefully. She thought about the weeks of isolation, the way she'd been erased from the unit, the institutional machinery that had been designed to silence her. She thought about Patricia Gomez and the intelligence officer, and however many other women had been broken by Garrett's behavior. "If I don't do this," Sarah said quietly, "then nothing changes. He keeps doing this to other people, and I spend the rest of my life knowing I had the opportunity to stop it and I didn't." Torres nodded slowly, as if she'd been expecting that answer. "Then we start by gathering testimonies from other victims. This can't be just your word against his. We need a pattern. We need multiple voices telling similar stories." Over the next 3 weeks, Torres and Chen became Sarah's lifelines. They worked methodically, carefully approaching potential witnesses and victims. Patricia Gomez agreed to meet with Sarah, and when she did, the intelligence officer wept, years of suppressed trauma finally finding voice. Gomez described how Garrett had isolated her, how he'd made inappropriate physical contact, how he'd implied that her career advancement depended on her accepting his behavior. "I was too scared to fight back," Gomez said, her hands trembling. "I just requested a transfer and tried to forget, but I never forgot. Every day I wondered if I should have said something, if there were other women he was doing this to." A young corpsman named Derek Martinez contacted Chen after hearing through the naval grapevine that something was happening. Martinez had served under Garrett and had witnessed inappropriate conduct directed at female personnel. He'd kept quiet out of fear, but learning that Sarah had fought back had given him courage. "He's a predator," Martinez said bluntly when they met. "He uses his position to target people who can't fight back, but he also uses his position to control people who might report him. I'm willing to testify, but I'm terrified about what it'll cost me." "We'll protect you," Torres promised. though both Sarah and Martinez understood that was partially a lie. No one could truly protect them from the consequences of challenging a decorated commander. Another female operator, Ensign Rebecca Liu, came forward with her own story. She'd been in Garrett's unit for 8 months and had experienced progressively inappropriate behavior, comments about her appearance, unnecessary physical contact during training, deliberate isolation from the rest of the team. "I didn't know what to do," Liu said, tears streaming down her face. "I thought maybe I was overreacting. Maybe I was being too sensitive. But hearing about what happened to you, I realized this wasn't about me being weak or paranoid. This was about him being predatory." Sarah began to understand that her isolation had been strategic. Garrett had ensured that she didn't know about the other victims, just as he'd ensured they didn't know about each other. By keeping them isolated, he'd prevented the very thing now happening, the formation of a unified voice. Torres used her JAG credentials to access Garrett's personnel file, which revealed a troubling history. There had been 3 previous complaints about his conduct, all filed anonymously or withdrawn before investigation. One female officer had requested a transfer specifically to escape his unit. Another had taken a medical discharge. The pattern was undeniable once you knew to look for it. "This is what we needed," Torres said, her voice grim but determined. "Anonymous complaints are deniable, but when we combine them with testimony from multiple current and former personnel, a pattern emerges that can't be explained away." Sarah's role began to transform. She was no longer simply a victim. She was becoming the catalyst, the person whose willingness to speak had given others permission to do the same. She attended secret meetings with Torres and Chen, listening as more stories emerged. She documented everything, cross-referenced timelines, helped Torres build the framework for a comprehensive case. But the psychological cost was significant. Sarah was experiencing what trauma specialists call vicarious trauma, the secondary effects of listening to and absorbing the traumatic experiences of others. She carried the weight of Patricia Gomez's suppressed tears, Derek Martinez's fear, Rebecca Liu's shattered confidence. She held their stories inside her, adding them to her own burden. One evening, after a particularly difficult meeting where a female junior officer had described how Garrett's behavior had led her to contemplate suicide, Sarah found herself sitting alone in her barracks, her body shaking with a combination of rage and despair. "This is too much," she whispered to herself. "This is too much for one person to carry." But then her phone buzzed with a message from Torres. "You're not alone. We're building something bigger than this. Trust the process." Sarah realized that Torres was right. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every person Garrett had ever harmed, every person he might harm in the future, every woman who'd ever been silenced by institutional power. Chen appeared at her door later that evening. Without speaking, he handed her a sealed envelope. Inside was a letter from Patricia Gomez. "Sarah, I don't have the words to express my gratitude. For years, I've been haunted by my silence, wondering if I should have done more. Watching you stand up, watching you refuse to disappear, it's given me back a part of myself that I thought was lost forever. Whatever comes next, know that you've already changed things. You've already made a difference. Thank you for being brave enough to do what I couldn't." Sarah read the letter 3 times, each time feeling something shift inside her. She was no longer just a victim seeking justice for herself. She was a voice for the silenced, a barrier against institutional corruption, a woman who'd refused to accept the system's attempt to erase her. The building blocks of something momentous were falling into place, and while Sarah didn't know exactly what would come next, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She was no longer fighting alone. The formal investigation was launched on a Friday morning in early October, exactly 6 weeks after the incident in Garrett's office. Lieutenant Commander Rebecca Torres had finally accumulated enough evidence and testimony to trigger an official inquiry. The decision came from Captain Michael Richardson himself. though Torres suspected he'd made it reluctantly, pressured by the accumulating weight of testimonies and documentation that could no longer be ignored. Sarah received notification that she would be interviewed by an independent investigator, a naval officer named Captain Jennifer Hayes, brought in from outside the San Diego facility specifically to handle the investigation. The message was clear. This was being taken seriously enough to warrant external oversight. Hayes had a reputation within Navy JAG circles as a no-nonsense officer with an extraordinary conviction rate in misconduct cases. Sarah sat in a sterile conference room on base, facing Captain Hayes across a metal table. A court reporter sat to the side, recording every word. Sarah had rehearsed this moment with Torres dozens of times, but no amount of preparation could fully ease the anxiety of reliving the trauma publicly. "Walk me through the incident on October 3rd, Hayes said, her tone professional but not cold. "Start from the beginning." Sarah began to speak, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. She described how she'd received the message summoning her to Garrett's office, how she'd walked up the stairs nodding the empty hallways, how she'd entered his office at his command. She described his words, every accusation, every insult, every attempt to undermine her legitimacy as a soldier. "And then," Hayes prompted. "And then he stood up from his desk and came around to face me," Sarah continued. She described the moment he'd reached for her, the split-second decision to defend herself, the takedown that had lasted perhaps 3 seconds but felt like an eternity. She described the look on his face as he lay on the floor, shock, rage, and something darker, calculation. Hayes listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable. When Sarah finished, Hayes reviewed her notes and looked up. "You mentioned you have recordings of previous interactions with Commander Garrett. I'd like to hear those." Sarah pulled out her phone and played the audio files. They were damning, Garrett's voice coming through clearly, making inappropriate comments about her appearance, her body, her femininity. His tone was predatory, the subtext unmistakable. There was no room for interpretation, no way to characterize these as innocent comments taken out of context. Hayes's expression hardened as she listened. When the recordings finished, she made a note and looked directly at Sarah. "This is comprehensive documentation," Hayes said. "The timeline, the journal entries, these recordings. You've done exactly what I tell victims to do. You've created a record that's difficult to dismiss." Over the next 2 weeks, Hayes conducted interviews with every witness Sarah had identified. Patricia Gomez testified for 4 hours, describing how Garrett had isolated her, how he'd implied that her career advancement depended on accepting his behavior, how she'd ultimately requested a transfer to escape his unit. The pain in her voice was audible, her testimony detailed and credible. Derek Martinez described witnessing Garrett's inappropriate behavior directed at multiple female personnel. He detailed specific incidents, how Garrett had cornered a female medic in a storage room, how he'd made comments about another operator's body that were explicitly sexual in nature, how he'd created a climate of fear and intimidation. Rebecca Liu testified about her own experiences, describing the progressive nature of Garrett's inappropriate conduct. She explained how he'd isolated her from the team, how he'd used his position to create situations where they were alone together, how his behavior had become increasingly inappropriate until she'd finally requested a transfer out of his unit. But Hayes didn't stop there. She expanded the investigation beyond the immediate circle of victims. She requested access to Garrett's personnel records, his financial records, his deployment history. What she found was a complex portrait of a man whose behavior extended far beyond isolated incidents of sexual harassment. Garrett's financial records revealed serious irregularities. He'd been submitting inflated expense reports for training exercises. He'd claimed reimbursements for equipment purchases that never occurred. Over the past 5 years, he'd received approximately $90,000 in fraudulent reimbursements. It wasn't just misconduct toward personnel. It was also criminal fraud. Hayes also discovered that Garrett had been passed over for promotion 3 times. Each promotion board had noted concerns about his leadership style, his management of personnel, and unspecified interpersonal issues. The notes became progressively more critical with each board, suggesting that senior officers had been aware of problems with his command, but had never formally documented what those problems were. One particularly damning discovery came when Hayes interviewed a retired admiral who'd served alongside Garrett 20 years earlier. The admiral confirmed that Garrett had been investigated for inappropriate conduct even then, but that the complaint had been withdrawn after Garrett allegedly threatened the complainant's career. "This isn't new behavior," the admiral told Hayes. "This is a pattern that's been going on for decades. The system failed to stop it then, and it's continued to fail." Garrett's defense crumbled under the weight of accumulated evidence. When Hayes finally interviewed him, he attempted to maintain his position, that Sarah had attacked him unprovoked, that the other testimonies were fabrications, that the financial irregularities were accounting errors. But his story didn't hold up against the detailed documentation and corroborating witnesses. Hayes presented Garrett with the audio recordings of his inappropriate comments. She showed him the testimony of multiple witnesses. She confronted him with the financial fraud. She asked him directly about the previous complaint from 20 years earlier, the one that had been withdrawn under mysterious circumstances. Garrett's composure fractured. He began making excuses, then accusations, then threats. He claimed that Sarah had recorded him without consent, which violated federal wiretapping laws. He suggested that Hayes was biased against him. He invoked his decades of service, his combat record, his contributions to the military. None of it mattered. By the end of the interview, Garrett's carefully constructed defense had collapsed entirely. Hayes had systematically dismantled every excuse, every alternate explanation, every attempt to reframe the narrative. When Hayes presented her preliminary findings to Captain Richardson, the news rippled through the base like a shock wave. The preliminary report concluded that there was substantial evidence supporting allegations of sexual harassment, abuse of authority, and fraudulent financial conduct by Commander James Garrett. The investigation recommended that the case be referred for military court-martial proceedings. For Sarah, hearing the findings was surreal. She'd lived in a state of institutional doubt for so long that validation felt almost foreign. She'd been told she was unstable, that she was overreacting, that her word against Garrett's meant nothing. But Hayes's investigation had proven that her account was accurate, that the system's initial dismissal of her claims had been a failure, not a reflection of the truth. She sat in Tor's office, reading the preliminary report, tears streaming down her face. "You did it," Tor said quietly. "You actually did it. You broke through the institutional machinery that was designed to protect him." "It's not over," Sarah said, understanding that this was just the beginning of a longer process. "No," Tors agreed. "It's not over, but you've changed the trajectory. You've ensured that this doesn't get quietly buried in administrative files. Whatever comes next, you've already won the most important battle, the battle for truth." In the weeks following Hayes's preliminary findings, other personnel began coming forward. A female linguist who'd served under Garrett in Afghanistan described how he'd sexually assaulted her during a deployment. A female intelligence officer reported that Garrett had threatened her career when she'd rejected his advances. Each new testimony added weight to the case, made it clearer that this wasn't a single incident or a misunderstanding, but a systematic pattern of predatory behavior. The command structure could no longer maintain the fiction that Garrett was a decorated officer with an impeccable record. The evidence was overwhelming, documented, and corroborated by multiple independent witnesses. The narrative had shifted. Garrett was no longer the innocent victim of a false accusation. He was a predator who'd exploited his position for decades, and the system that had protected him was finally being forced to acknowledge that reality. For Sarah, sitting in her barracks late at night, she realized that something fundamental had changed. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer being erased. She had fought the machinery of institutional power, and against impossible odds she had prevailed. The battle for justice was far from over, but she had won the first and most important victory. She had refused to disappear. The military court-martial of Commander James Garrett began on a cold November morning in a federal courthouse located on Naval Base San Diego. The proceeding was technically closed to the general public, as was standard for military courts-martial, but word had spread throughout the Navy community. This wasn't just another administrative hearing. This was a reckoning. Sarah sat in the gallery, flanked by Rebecca Torres and Marcus Chen. She wore her dress uniform, her medals pinned precisely, her bearing perfect. The trident insignia on her chest seemed to weigh more than it ever had before. She'd almost lost everything because she'd earned that badge of honor, and now, through her testimony, she would potentially ensure that the man who tried to destroy her would face consequences. The prosecutor, a Navy JAG officer named Captain David Morrison, had built his case meticulously. He'd organized the evidence in a narrative arc that was devastating in its clarity. Years of predatory behavior, systematic abuse of authority, financial fraud, and repeated attempts to silence victims. The case file was 2 inches thick, filled with documentation, recordings, and witness statements. The judge, a Navy captain named Malcolm Chen, sat at the bench with an expression of grim determination. He'd been selected specifically for his reputation as a fair but uncompromising jurist. The panel of 6 military officers, 3 junior officers, and 3 senior NCOs, who would serve as the jury, sat in 2 rows, their faces neutral but attentive. Commander Garrett entered the courtroom in full dress uniform, his chest covered with ribbons and decorations. His defense attorney, a civilian lawyer named Robert Sullivan, had positioned him to appear as the decorated war hero, the man with decades of service being brought down by a single junior officer's unsubstantiated claims. But that narrative collapsed within the first hour of testimony. Sarah took the witness stand, her hand on a Bible as she was sworn to tell the truth. Morrison began with foundational questions, establishing her credentials, her service record, her achievements. He then walked her through the incident in Garrett's office with excruciating detail, asking her to describe not just what happened, but how it happened, what was said, what she felt, what she understood about Garrett's intentions. "Lieutenant Mitchell," Morrison asked, "when Commander Garrett reached for you, what was your assessment of his intent?" "To physically dominate me," Sarah said clearly. "To use his size and strength to overpower me, to assault me." "And what did you do?" "I defended myself using techniques I'd been trained in. I executed a defensive takedown that neutralized the threat." Sullivan attempted to discredit Sarah during cross-examination, but she'd been meticulously prepared by Torres. He tried to suggest that she'd misinterpreted Garrett's intentions, that perhaps he'd been attempting to demonstrate a technique, that she'd overreacted out of paranoia or instability. "Isn't it true," Sullivan asked, "that you've been documented as having emotional instability?" "That documentation came from Commander Garrett," Sarah responded calmly. "After I defended myself against his assault, I would characterize that as motivated testimony, not objective assessment." Sullivan tried another angle. "Isn't it true that you voluntarily recorded Commander Garrett without his knowledge, which is a federal crime?" "The federal wiretapping statute has an exception for parties to a conversation," Torres had coached her. "I was a party to those conversations. Additionally, I recorded them because I was documenting a pattern of inappropriate conduct. I was protecting myself from the very situation that occurred." Sarah's testimony lasted 3 days. By the end, even Sullivan seemed to understand that his client was indefensible. The evidence was simply too comprehensive, too well documented, too corroborated. Then came Patricia Gomez. She took the stand trembling, her hands shaking as she was sworn in. For 15 years, she'd carried the trauma of what Garrett had done to her in silence. Now, finally, she had the opportunity to speak. Gomez described how Garrett had isolated her, how he'd made it clear that her career advancement depended on accepting his advances, how she'd felt trapped between her ambitions and her dignity. She described the moment when she'd finally requested a transfer, and how Garrett had warned her that going public would destroy her career. "He told me," Gomez said, her voice breaking, "that nobody would believe me, that his word as a commander would always outweigh mine as a junior officer, that if I tried to report him, I'd be the one whose career would be destroyed." "And did you report him?" Morrison asked gently. "No," Gomez whispered. "I was too afraid, and for 15 years I've regretted that decision. Watching Lieutenant Mitchell stand up to him, watching her refuse to be silenced, it's shown me that I could have done the same. I just didn't have the courage." When Gomez stepped down, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom except Garrett's. His expression remained impassive, but Sarah could see his jaw clenching, could see the calculation in his eyes as he recognized that his defense was crumbling. Derek Martinez testified about witnessing Garrett's inappropriate behavior. Rebecca Liu described the progression of harassment that had eventually forced her to request a transfer. The female linguist from Afghanistan provided graphic testimony about being sexually assaulted by Garrett during a deployment, an assault she'd never reported because she'd known it would be her word against his. The prosecution also called financial experts who detailed the fraudulent expense reports, accounting irregularities that extended back 7 years, approximately $120,000 in fraudulent reimbursements, each one individually prosecutable, each one another nail in the coffin of Garrett's defense. Perhaps most damaging was the testimony from the retired admiral who'd served with Garrett 20 years earlier. The admiral testified that he had personal knowledge of a previous sexual assault allegation against Garrett that had been withdrawn under circumstances that suggested coercion or intimidation. "I've always regretted not pursuing that complaint further," the admiral said. Commander Garrett was protected by his rank, by his service record, by the system's unwillingness to believe women over decorated officers. If I'd been braver, if I'd done my job properly, I might have prevented years of subsequent harm. Sullivan's defense was weak and unconvincing. He attempted to suggest that Sarah had fabricated the entire incident, that the recordings were manipulated, that the other witnesses were coordinating false testimony. But he provided no evidence for any of these claims. He simply asserted them, as if repetition could override the mountains of documented proof. When the prosecution rested its case, the outcome seemed predetermined. The closing arguments lasted 6 hours. Morrison presented a methodical review of the evidence, walking the jury through each piece of testimony, each document, each recording. He painted a portrait of a man who'd systematically exploited his position, who'd harmed multiple people, who'd used his authority to silence victims and cover his tracks. Sullivan's closing was perfunctory. He tried to appeal to the jury's sympathy for Garrett's decades of service, but it rang hollow against the weight of evidence. He suggested that the jury should be skeptical of Sarah's account, but he'd provided no alternative explanation that made sense. The jury deliberated for 23 hours. When they returned, their verdict was unanimous across all charges: guilty of sexual assault, guilty of sexual harassment, guilty of abuse of authority, guilty of witness intimidation, guilty of fraudulent financial conduct. 6 counts of guilty on crimes that would end Garrett's career, strip him of his rank, erase his pension, and potentially result in imprisonment. When the verdict was announced, Sarah felt something break open inside her, not in the sense of shattering, but in the sense of releasing. The pressure she'd been carrying for months, the weight of institutional doubt, the trauma of being silenced and dismissed, suddenly lifted. She wasn't vindicated because she needed external validation, but she was vindicated because the system had finally recognized what she'd always known. She was telling the truth. Garrett's face went ashen. His defense attorney placed a hand on his shoulder, but Garrett barely seemed to notice. He was staring at something beyond the courtroom, perhaps finally understanding the magnitude of what he'd lost. The sentencing hearing came a week later. The military judge sentenced Garrett to 8 years in federal prison, dishonorable discharge, complete loss of rank and pension, and a permanent bar from any federal employment. His medals and decorations would be stripped. His service record would be permanently tainted. Everything he'd built, everything he'd achieved, everything he'd believed defined him was being erased. When Garrett was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, Sarah watched with a complex mixture of emotions. She felt satisfaction that justice had finally been served, but she also felt something like sadness. Sadness for the years of harm that could have been prevented if the system had worked properly. Sadness for the victims who'd suffered before her. Sadness that it had taken her willingness to risk everything to force the institution to confront its own failures. But the most significant moment came outside the courtroom, when reporters were waiting. Sarah, Tors, and the other witnesses emerged together, and the cameras immediately turned toward them. "How do you feel about the verdict?" a reporter called out. Sarah took a breath and spoke clearly, her words steady and measured. "I feel vindicated, but more importantly, I hope this verdict sends a message that abuse of authority will not be tolerated, that victims will be believed, that the system will finally hold power accountable." As she spoke, she looked directly at the cameras, directly at the Navy community watching, directly at every person who'd been silenced or doubted. "I stood up because I had to," Sarah continued, "because silence was complicity, because the only way things change is if someone refuses to accept injustice. I hope my story gives courage to others facing similar situations. You are not alone. Your truth matters, and the system can be forced to listen." The words resonated through the military establishment like a shock wave. Within days, news outlets were discussing not just Garrett's conviction, but the systemic failures that had allowed his behavior to continue for so long. The Navy was forced to confront uncomfortable questions about how many other Garretts existed within its ranks, protected by the same institutional machinery that had nearly protected him. The reckoning had only just begun. 6 months after Garrett's conviction, Sarah stood at the edge of the same beach where she'd watched the sun rise on her first day of her assignment to his unit. The Pacific Ocean looked different to her now, not as a symbol of the challenges ahead, but as a reminder of survival. The water that had tested her, broken her down, forced her to choose between surrender and resistance, still crashed against the shore with the same indifferent power, but she had learned to navigate it. She was no longer on administrative leave, no longer isolated, no longer invisible. Sarah had been reassigned to a different unit, one that operated under a new command structure designed specifically to address the failures that had allowed Garrett's behavior to flourish. Her new commanding officer, Captain Elena Rodriguez, had made it clear from day one that Sarah's presence was not just accepted, but valued. Rodriguez had served in the military long enough to recognize injustice, and she deliberately created a command culture that prioritized accountability and integrity. "You've done something extraordinary," Rodriguez had told her during Sarah's first day in the new unit. "You've forced this institution to look at itself and confront its failures. That takes a specific kind of courage." But Sarah didn't feel extraordinary. She felt exhausted in a way that sleep couldn't repair, the exhaustion that comes from carrying the weight of systemic change. The nightmares had faded, but they hadn't completely disappeared. She still occasionally woke in the darkness, her heart racing, experiencing phantom moments of that afternoon in Garrett's office. The trauma had transformed from acute panic into something more manageable, a scar rather than an open wound. What surprised her most was how quickly the wider Navy community began to change. Within weeks of Garrett's conviction, new protocols were established across all Navy commands. An independent hotline for reporting sexual harassment and abuse of authority was created, explicitly designed to bypass commanding officers so that victims could report misconduct without fear of retaliation. Mandatory training on sexual harassment and abuse of authority was implemented for all commanding officers and senior NCOs. New investigations procedures were established that required external oversight and prohibited commanding officers from controlling investigations into their own conduct. Most significantly, a task force was created specifically to review past complaints and cases that had been dismissed or buried. Within months, 17 additional cases were reopened, cases involving other commanders, other victims, other instances of institutional failure. 6 officers were prosecuted as a result of these reopened investigations. Another 8 were forced to resign or accept early retirement rather than face court-martial. Sarah hadn't anticipated that her willingness to speak would create a domino effect, but she should have. Silence was self-perpetuating, but so was truth. Once the truth had been spoken, once it had been validated by the institution, other victims felt emboldened to come forward. The system that had protected predators for decades was finally being forced to confront its own complicity. One morning, Sarah received a letter from Patricia Gomez. The intelligence officer had been promoted and reassigned to an oversight position specifically designed to monitor command conduct and ensure that officers were held accountable for their actions. In her letter, Gomez thanked Sarah again and added a personal note. "You saved my life. Not just from Garrett, but from the person I was becoming, someone so afraid that I'd stopped living. You reminded me what courage looks like." Sarah's daily life had returned to something approximating normalcy, but with a new dimension of purpose. She was training the next generation of special operators, and she deliberately sought out other female soldiers, taking time to mentor them, to show them that they belonged, to ensure that they understood they had agency and support. Several of these young women had confided in her about experiences with inappropriate conduct from senior officers. Sarah connected them with Tors, who was now working full-time on cases of military sexual assault and abuse of authority. 3 months after her reassignment, Sarah was selected to lead a training exercise, the same type of exercise that Garrett had designed to isolate and demoralize her. But this one was different. Sarah created a training environment that pushed operators to their limits while simultaneously emphasizing teamwork, mutual support, and respect. She deliberately paired experienced operators with less experienced ones, creating mentorship moments within the stress of training. She corrected performance issues while validating effort. She was tough but fair, demanding but encouraging. When the exercise concluded, her commanding officer pulled her aside. "Mitchell," Captain Rodriguez said, "I've reviewed the performance reports. Your team had the fastest completion time of any unit in the past 3 years. More importantly, every single operator reported feeling supported and respected. That's what real leadership looks like." Sarah's peers began to recognize something in her that transcended her physical capabilities or tactical skills. She had a presence, an understanding of human psychology, a commitment to justice, a willingness to stand against institutional corruption. Senior officers started requesting her for high-profile assignments and advisory positions. A 3-star admiral reached out personally to ask if she'd be interested in working on a task force designed to address systemic problems in Navy command culture. "I want to build something," Sarah told Tors over coffee one afternoon. "Something that prevents what happened to me from happening to anyone else. I want to be part of the institutional change, not just a victim of institutional failure." Tors nodded. "The Navy needs people like you, people who have experienced the system's failures and have the credibility to push for change from within." 6 months after her reassignment, a full year after the incident in Garrett's office, Sarah received official notification that she'd been commended for exceptional service and extraordinary moral courage. The commendation was unusual because it explicitly referenced her actions in reporting Garrett's misconduct and her willingness to testify despite personal cost. The Navy was publicly acknowledging that what she'd done mattered, that her courage had created institutional change. More significantly, she was promoted to the rank of lieutenant commander and assigned to the Naval Special Warfare Command's newly created Office of Professional Development and Accountability. Her role would involve reviewing command practices, identifying potential problems before they escalated, and ensuring that the Navy's commitment to accountability extended beyond public relations into actual systemic change. On the day she received her promotion, Sarah stood in front of her commanding officer as she was officially advanced in rank. As her new insignia was pinned to her uniform, she thought about the woman she'd been a year ago, scared, isolated, fighting a system designed to silence her. That woman seemed like a different person now, though Sarah understood that she was the same person, just transformed by the experience of confronting institutional power and refusing to accept injustice. The evening of her promotion, Sarah returned to the beach where she'd stood exactly 1 year earlier. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The waves were gentler today, less aggressive, more rhythmic. She stood in silence, watching the ocean, feeling the salt spray on her face. She thought about Patricia Gomez and the other victims who'd finally found their voices. She thought about Derek Martinez and Rebecca Liu, and the naval personnel whose careers had been saved because the system had finally been forced to acknowledge its failures. She thought about the young female operators she was now mentoring, showing them that they belonged, that their presence strengthened the military, that they didn't need to accept abuse as the price of service. But most importantly, she thought about herself, about the journey from being erased and silenced to becoming a voice for institutional change. She thought about the moment in Garrett's office when she'd made the split-second decision to defend herself, not just physically, but morally. She thought about how that single act of resistance had rippled outward, creating consequences that extended far beyond her individual experience. A seagull passed overhead, crying out into the gathering darkness. Sarah watched it disappear into the horizon, free and unencumbered, moving toward whatever lay ahead. She understood now that her real service had only just begun. The medals on her chest, the rank on her shoulders, the commendations in her file, these were recognition of past actions. But her future lay in ensuring that the Navy continued to evolve, that accountability remained paramount, that the institution finally lived up to its stated values of honor, courage, and commitment. Sarah turned away from the ocean and walked back toward the base, toward her team, toward the work ahead. She was no longer fighting against the system. She was part of something bigger, part of a movement to transform the institution from within, to hold power accountable, to ensure that no one else would have to choose between their career and their dignity. The nightmare was over. The real work was just beginning. And for the first time since she'd earned her trident, Sarah felt genuinely at peace. Not because the struggle was finished, but because she finally understood her purpose. She was a Navy SEAL, a warrior, a leader, a voice for justice. And she would spend the rest of her career ensuring that the system worked for everyone, not just those with power. As she walked back into the facility, her new uniform catching the last rays of sunlight, Sarah allowed herself to smile. She had survived. More than that, she had prevailed. And in prevailing, she had changed something fundamental about the institution she served. The future stretched ahead, uncertain, challenging, but filled with possibility. Sarah Mitchell walked toward it with the same determination that had carried her through Bud S., through the nightmare of Garrett's predation, through the institutional machinery designed to silence her. She had proven, beyond any doubt, that she belonged. And now, she would ensure that every person who came after her would have the opportunity to belong as well.
Sai perché dovresti studiare per lunedì? No, 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 fermi! Sai perché dovresti studiare per lunedì? Perché tu hai saltato mercoledì, giovedì e venerdì di scuola, o giovedì e venerdì comunque. Hai saltato 2 settimane di scuola, una perché c'era vacanza, è ok, ma tu hai deciso di stare a casa di più del dovuto. I professori mi hai detto che quello di matematica, non mi ricordo più quale, si è arrabbiata. Quindi sì, per lunedì tu sei pronto. Cas, mannaggia la miseria, sei stato a casa 7-10 giorni. Vai a studiare, porca puttana. Te lo dico più, Cas. Invece di continuare a comprare giochi. L'altro giorno avevo detto di comprare Ark, così ci giochiamo insieme. Tutti tranne te. Tu devi studiare, piantala lì. Quando è ci giochiamo insieme su Minecraft. Piantala lì. Cretino. Certo che vai a studiare.